In the grey of a rainy afternoon, the metallic sound of gates closing echoes in the police barracks. A black horse, a former patrol partner, is led to a dark stable, awaiting its final sentence. Behind the rusted bars, a fragile old woman watches the animal, unnoticed by anyone. Silently, she advances with slow steps, carrying a worn bag of apples. The smell of the fruit breaks through the heavy air, and the horse raises its head, fixing its gaze on her. The police officers laugh, turning their backs and leaving the area in semi-darkness. The woman extends her hand through the bars as the animal gently touches her with its snout. In the exact second the two touch, silence seems to face the entire city. Love stories with animals? Subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now we return to our story. The news spread through Millbrook like wildfire. On a dry summer day, carried by whispers from the courthouse steps to the corner diner, until every soul in the small Kentucky town had heard the devastating announcement. Thunder, the majestic black stallion who had served alongside the sheriff's department for 7 faithful years, would be put down. The decision came down from the county commissioners with the cold efficiency that bureaucrats were known for, delivered in a manila folder stamped with official seals and signatures. Sheriff Tom Bradley stood in the cramped office that smelled of coffee grounds and old leather, staring at the paperwork that sealed Thunder's fate. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his weathered face as he read the clinical language that reduced years of loyal service to a simple liability assessment. The stallion had suffered a severe injury to his left rear leg during a high-speed pursuit through the winding back roads that snaked around Miller's Creek. What should have been a routine chase of teenagers joyriding in a stolen pickup truck had turned into a nightmare when Thunder stumbled in a pothole hidden by autumn leaves. The veterinarian's report was equally merciless in its precision. Torn ligaments, damaged tendons, a hairline fracture that would never heal properly. Dr. Patricia Morse had examined the horse with the thoroughness that had made her the most trusted large animal vet in 3 counties, but even her expertise couldn't change the harsh reality. Thunder would never again possess the speed, agility, and reliability required of a police mount. In the world of law enforcement, a horse that couldn't perform its duties was simply a liability waiting to happen. Deputy. Jake Miller knocked softly on the doorframe, his young face bearing the weight of someone forced to deliver bad news. He'd been the one riding Thunder during that fateful pursuit, and the guilt had been eating at him for weeks. The 26-year-old officer had joined the force straight out of college with dreams of making a difference in his hometown. Never imagining he'd be responsible for ending a career that had begun before he was old enough to drive. "Sheriff," the county called again, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They want to know when we're scheduling the procedure." Bradley looked up from the papers, his steel-gray eyes reflecting years of difficult decisions. He'd been sheriff of Millbrook County for 15 years, long enough to know that sometimes the job required him to make choices that felt wrong in his gut, but were deemed necessary by those who controlled the budget. Thunder had been more than just a working animal. He'd been a partner, a symbol of strength and reliability that the community had come to associate with justice and protection. The stallion stood in the small paddock behind the sheriff's office, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the late afternoon sun. Even with his injury, Thunder maintained the proud bearing that had made him legendary among the local children who would gather at the fence during school field trips. His dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, as if he understood the gravity of the conversations happening around him. Margaret Foster, the dispatcher who had worked at the sheriff's office longer than anyone could remember, appeared in the doorway carrying a steaming cup of coffee. Her silver hair was pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn for 30 years, and her kind eyes showed the strain of the past few weeks. She'd been the one to coordinate Thunder's care after the accident, driving him to appointments and ensuring he received the best treatment available. "Sheriff, there's got to be something we can do," Margaret said, setting the coffee on the desk with hands that trembled slightly. "That horse has given everything to this community. Surely there's someone who would take him in, give him a peaceful retirement." Bradley appreciated Margaret's sentiment, but he'd already explored every option he could think of. The county had been clear about their position. They wouldn't fund the care of an animal that couldn't perform its designated function, and they certainly wouldn't assume the liability if Thunder were to be placed with a private citizen who might not be equipped to handle such a large, powerful animal. The decision-makers in the state capital saw only numbers on a spreadsheet, not the living, breathing symbol of service that had touched so many lives. The sheriff walked to the window that overlooked the paddock, watching as Thunder lifted his magnificent head to catch a breeze that carried the scent of approaching rain. For 7 years, that horse had been his partner in countless situations. Thunder had remained calm during domestic disputes, had provided a reassuring presence at community events, and had shown remarkable courage during that terrible flood. 3 years ago, when they'd rescued the Henderson family from their submerged farmhouse. The sound of gravel crunching under tires drew Bradley's attention to the parking lot, where a small crowd had begun to gather. Word of Thunder's fate had spread beyond official channels, and concerned citizens were arriving to voice their opinions. Among them, he recognized Sarah Chen, who ran the local newspaper, her camera already in hand as she prepared to document what would undoubtedly become front-page news. Dr. Morse pulled up in her veterinary truck, the same vehicle that had brought both hope and heartbreak to countless farms throughout the region. She climbed out slowly, her movements reflecting the weight of the conversation she was about to have. Patricia had been caring for Thunder since he was a young colt, first purchased by the county from the prestigious Wyndham stables outside of Lexington. She knew every scar on his body, every quirk of his personality, every small victory and setback in his training. "Sheriff," Dr. Morse said as she entered the office, removing her worn baseball cap to reveal graying hair that spoke of decades spent working with animals. "I've been thinking about Thunder's situation, and I want to make sure we've considered all the alternatives." Bradley nodded, gesturing for her to take a seat. He respected Patricia's opinion above all others when it came to matters involving the animals under their care. If she had ideas he hadn't considered, he was prepared to listen, even though his experience told him that the decision had likely already been made by people who would never set foot in Millbrook County. "The injury is severe," Dr. Morse continued, "but it's not necessarily a sentence for what you're planning. With proper care and a modified lifestyle, Thunder could still have years of quality life ahead of him. He'd never be a working horse again, but he could certainly serve as a companion animal or even help with therapeutic programs." Margaret's face brightened at the suggestion, but Bradley remained skeptical. The county's position had been made abundantly clear. They would not continue to invest resources in an animal that couldn't fulfill its professional obligations. The bureaucrats who made these decisions lived in a world of budget constraints and liability concerns, not emotional attachments to four-legged partners. Outside, the crowd continued to grow as news of Thunder's predicament spread through social media and word of mouth. Children pressed their faces against the fence, some crying as they watched the horse that had been a fixture at school visits and community parades. Their parents stood behind them, many wiping away tears of their own as they contemplated the loss of something that had represented stability and protection in their small town. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the paddock as Thunder stood quietly, occasionally lifting his injured leg to relieve the pressure. His ears, perked up at the sound of familiar voices, and he turned his head toward the fence where a group of elementary school children had gathered. These were the same kids he'd patiently allowed to pet his neck during career day presentations, the ones who'd drawn pictures of him that still decorated the walls of the sheriff's office. As Sheriff Bradley watched the scene unfold, he felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. In a few hours, he would need to make the call that would set Thunder's final chapter in motion. The veterinarian would arrive with the necessary equipment, and the horse that had served his community with such distinction would quietly slip away, leaving behind only memories and an empty paddock that would serve as a constant reminder of bureaucratic efficiency triumphing over loyalty and service. The phone on his desk rang with the sharp insistence that had punctuated his career for more than a decade, but Sheriff Bradley let it ring as he continued to watch Thunder and the growing crowd of supporters who had come to say their goodbyes. Dorothy Henderson had always been invisible to most folks in Millbrook. At 78, she lived alone in a weathered Victorian house on Maple Street that had seen better days, its paint peeling like old skin, and its wraparound porch sagging under the weight of decades. The neighbors barely acknowledged her existence, save for the occasional nod when she walked to Miller's Market for groceries, her small frame moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that a fall at her age could mean the end of independence. She'd heard about Thunder's situation, the way she heard about everything else in town, through fragments of conversation overheard at the post office, whispered discussions at the pharmacy, and the hushed tones of concern that followed her wherever she went. People talked around her as if she were part of the furniture, an old woman whose opinions and feelings had somehow become irrelevant with the passage of time. But something about Thunder's story pierced through the protective shell Dorothy had built around her heart. As she sat in her faded armchair that evening, listening to the local news coverage on her old transistor radio, she felt a familiar ache in her chest. The reporter's clinical description of the decision to put down the injured police horse transported her back to a time when such decisions had been made about her own life, when doctors and social workers had discussed her future in the same detached tones. Dorothy had spent the last decade of her life being systematically dismissed by a world that seemed to view her as a burden rather than a person with value. Her children lived in distant cities, calling dutifully on holidays, but showing little interest in the daily struggles of an elderly parent who refused their suggestions to move into assisted living. The community that had once known her as an active, contributing member now saw only an aging woman who took up space and required resources. The night was unusually warm for October, and Dorothy found herself unable to sleep. She wrapped her thin robe around her shoulders and stepped onto the front porch, where the sounds of Millbrook after dark created a familiar symphony. In the distance, she could hear the low rumble of trucks on the interstate, carrying their cargo to destinations that seemed impossibly far from her small world. Her mind wandered to Thunder, standing alone in that paddock behind the sheriff's office, probably unaware that tomorrow might bring his final sunrise. The parallel between their situations was too obvious to ignore. Both of them considered liabilities by those in power, both deemed too costly to maintain, both facing an uncertain future because they could no longer serve the functions that had once made them valuable. By morning, Dorothy had made a decision that surprised even herself. She dressed carefully in her best Sunday dress, a navy blue frock with small pearl buttons that she'd worn to every important occasion for the past 15 years. Her arthritis made the task of fastening the buttons a challenge, but she persevered with the same determination that had carried her through 7 decades of life's various trials. The walk to the sheriff's office took longer than it would have in her younger years, but Dorothy was in no hurry. She used the time to organize her thoughts, to prepare for what she knew would be a difficult conversation with people who would likely view her request as the foolish whim of a lonely old woman. Her sensible shoes clicked against the sidewalk, with a rhythm that seemed to echo her resolve, and she carried her worn leather purse with the dignity of someone embarking on an important mission. Sheriff Bradley was surprised to see Dorothy Henderson standing in the doorway of his office, her small frame nearly dwarfed by the heavy wooden door. He'd known her by sight for years, the way everyone in a small town knows their neighbors, but he couldn't recall ever having an actual conversation with her. She seemed nervous but determined, her hands clasped tightly around the handle of her purse as she cleared her throat. "Sheriff Bradley," Dorothy began, her voice carrying more strength than her appearance might have suggested, "I've come to talk to you about Thunder." The sheriff set down the paperwork he'd been reviewing and gave her his full attention. There was something about her manner, a quiet dignity mixed with steely resolve that demanded respect. Margaret Foster looked up from her desk with obvious curiosity, and Deputy Miller paused in his conversation with Dr. Morse to listen to what the elderly woman had to say. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern," Bradley replied, his tone gentle but professional. "Thunder has meant a lot to this community, and I understand why people are upset about the decision." Dorothy took a step forward, her chin lifting slightly in a gesture of determination that had served her well throughout her life. "I didn't come here to voice my upset, Sheriff. I came here to offer a solution." The room fell silent, except for the familiar buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Dr. Morse turned her full attention to the conversation, while Margaret's fingers hovered motionless above her keyboard. The gravity in Dorothy's voice suggested that this was not a casual visit from a concerned citizen. "I want to take Thunder," Dorothy continued, her words clear and deliberate. "I want to provide him with a home where he can live out his remaining years with dignity and care." Sheriff Bradley blinked in surprise, certain he'd misheard the request. The idea of Dorothy Henderson, a woman who barely seemed capable of managing her own daily needs, taking responsibility for a 1,500-pound stallion, was so unexpected that he struggled to formulate a response. Deputy Miller was the first to speak, his young face showing the kind of well-meaning concern that often accompanied discussions about elderly relatives. "Mrs. Henderson, that's very generous of you, but Thunder is a large, powerful animal. He requires specialized care, proper facilities, and considerable physical strength to handle safely." Dorothy's expression didn't waver. She'd anticipated this response and had prepared herself for the inevitable chorus of doubts about her capabilities. "Deputy Miller, I may be old, but I'm not helpless. I have a large backyard with good fencing, and I'm willing to make whatever modifications are necessary to accommodate Thunder's needs." Dr. Morse stepped forward, her professional instincts engaged by the unexpected turn in the conversation. "Mrs. Henderson, I admire your compassion, but caring for a horse of Thunder's size requires daily maintenance, regular medical attention, and significant financial investment. Are you prepared for that level of commitment?" The questions continued. For nearly an hour, each one designed to highlight the impracticality of Dorothy's proposal. The officials spoke to her with the same patronizing tone she'd grown accustomed to hearing from doctors, bank employees, and well-meaning neighbors who seemed convinced that age had somehow robbed her of the ability to make reasonable decisions. But Dorothy had not survived 7 decades by backing down from challenges. She answered each question with careful consideration, demonstrating that she'd already thought through many of the practical concerns they raised. She'd researched the costs of hay, veterinary care, and stable construction. She'd calculated her monthly budget and determined that her modest savings, combined with her Social Security income, would be sufficient to provide for Thunder's needs. Mrs. Henderson, Sheriff Bradley finally said, his voice carrying the weight of someone. Accustomed to making difficult decisions, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but the county has liability concerns. If Thunder were to injure you or someone else while in your care, we could face significant legal consequences. Dorothy nodded, acknowledging the validity of his concern while maintaining her position. Sheriff, I understand your worries, and I'm prepared to sign any waiver or legal document necessary to protect the county from liability. What I'm not prepared to do is stand by and watch while a good, faithful animal is put down simply because he can no longer perform his job. The conviction in her voice surprised everyone in the room, including Dorothy herself. She'd spent so many years being dismissed and overlooked that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to advocate passionately for something she believed in. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying, like rediscovering a part of herself that had been buried under years of quiet resignation. Margaret Foster had been listening to the conversation with growing interest, and she finally spoke up. Sheriff, maybe we should consider Mrs. Henderson's offer. It's certainly better than the alternative, and if she's willing to assume the responsibility. But Dr. Morse shook her head, her professional ethics preventing her from endorsing what she saw as a potentially dangerous situation. I can't in good conscience recommend placing Thunder with someone who might not be able to provide adequate care. It wouldn't be fair to either the horse or Mrs. Henderson. As the debate continued around her, Dorothy felt the familiar sensation of being discussed rather than included in the conversation. These well-meaning people were making decisions about her capabilities without really knowing anything about her background or experiences. They saw only an elderly woman who lived alone, not someone who had once been considered an expert in matters they couldn't imagine. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade when Dorothy finally gathered her purse and prepared to leave. The meeting hadn't gone as she'd hoped, but she wasn't ready to surrender. As she walked toward the door, she turned back to face the room full of people who had spent the last hour explaining why her plan wouldn't work. Sheriff Bradley, she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength that had been absent from her earlier pleas. I'll be back tomorrow, and I'll keep coming back until you understand that Thunder deserves better than what you're planning for him. The determination in her voice left no doubt that Dorothy Henderson meant exactly what she said, even as the setting sun cast long shadows across the paddock where Thunder stood, unaware that his fate might depend on the resolve of an unlikely advocate. Charles Blackwood arrived at the sheriff's office in his gleaming silver Mercedes, the luxury vehicle looking distinctly out of place in the modest parking lot beside patrol cars and pickup trucks. At 55, Blackwood commanded respect through a combination of inherited wealth and carefully cultivated business acumen that had made him the most influential man in 3 counties. His perfectly tailored suit and confident stride spoke of someone accustomed to getting his way, whether through charm, persuasion, or the subtle application of financial pressure. Sheriff Bradley looked up from his desk with barely concealed irritation as Blackwood entered without knocking, his presence filling the small office with the scent of expensive cologne and the aura of entitlement that came naturally to men of his social standing. The businessman's salt and pepper hair was styled to perfection, and his manicured hands gestured with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades convincing people to see things his way. Tom, Blackwood said, using the sheriff's first name with the familiarity of someone who had contributed generously to his last election campaign. I hear you're having some difficulties with the Thunder situation. Margaret Foster's typing slowed as she strained to hear the conversation, her instincts telling her that Blackwood's arrival would complicate an already difficult situation. Deputy Miller, who had been organizing files near the reception desk, found himself unconsciously straightening his posture in the presence of a man whose opinion could influence his career prospects. "Mr. Blackwood," Sheriff Bradley replied, maintaining the professional tone he used with all citizens, but unable to completely hide his wariness. "If you're referring to the county's decision regarding Thunder, that matter is being handled through proper channels." Blackwood smiled with the confidence of someone who rarely encountered obstacles he couldn't overcome. He'd built his fortune through strategic investments in real estate and tourism, transforming inherited family land into the exclusive Blackwood Country Club that attracted wealthy visitors from Louisville, Nashville, and beyond. His operation included a championship golf course, luxury accommodations, and recreational facilities that catered to clients who expected perfection in every detail. "Tom, I think you know me well enough to understand that I don't involve myself in community affairs without good reason," Blackwood continued, settling into the chair across from the sheriff's desk without being invited. "I've been following the situation with Thunder, and I believe I have a solution that could benefit everyone involved." The businessman reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather folder containing official-looking documents. His movements were deliberate and practiced, suggesting that he'd prepared for this conversation with the same attention to detail that he applied to all his business dealings. "I'm prepared to take responsibility for Thunder's care," Blackwood announced, sliding the folder across the desk. "My property includes professional-grade stabling facilities, full-time staff experienced in equine care, and veterinary services that exceed anything available elsewhere in the county." Sheriff Bradley opened the folder and found detailed photographs of the Blackwood Country Club's impressive facilities. The stables were indeed magnificent, with spacious stalls, modern equipment, and manicured grounds that looked more like a resort than a working farm. The proposed care plan was comprehensive, outlining every aspect of Thunder's daily routine, from feeding schedules to exercise protocols. Dr. Morse, who had remained in the office to finalize Thunder's medical records, leaned forward to examine the documents. As a professional, she couldn't help but be impressed by the quality of facilities and the thoroughness of the care plan. From a purely practical standpoint, Blackwood's proposal addressed every concern that had been raised about Thunder's long-term care. "This is quite comprehensive, Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Morse admitted, though her tone carried a note of puzzlement. "May I ask what prompted your interest in taking on this responsibility?" Blackwood's smile widened, revealing teeth that had been professionally whitened to match his carefully crafted image. "Doctor, I've always believed that successful businesses have a responsibility to give back to their communities. Thunder has served this town with distinction, and I simply want to ensure that his retirement years are comfortable and dignified." The explanation sounded reasonable, even admirable, but Sheriff Bradley had dealt with enough politicians and businessmen to recognize when the full story wasn't being told. Blackwood's sudden interest in Thunder's welfare seemed too convenient, too perfectly timed to be entirely altruistic. "That's generous of you, Charles," Bradley said carefully, "but the county has already received another offer to care for Thunder. Mrs. Dorothy Henderson has expressed interest in providing him with a home." Blackwood's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of annoyance that he quickly masked with practiced ease. The mention of Dorothy Henderson's name seemed to catch him off guard, as if he hadn't anticipated competition from such an unlikely source. "Sheriff, surely you can't be serious about considering that woman's proposal," Blackwood said, his tone carrying just enough condescension to make his opinion clear. "Dorothy Henderson is a sweet old lady, but she's completely unprepared to handle an animal of Thunder's size and requirements." Deputy Miller shifted uncomfortably at the dismissive tone, while Margaret Foster's typing stopped altogether as she listened to Blackwood's assessment of Dorothy's capabilities. The businessman continued, his voice taking on the authoritative quality he used in board meetings and business negotiations. "I've made inquiries about Mrs. Henderson's situation," Blackwood continued, pulling out his smartphone and scrolling through notes he'd apparently prepared in advance. "She lives alone in a house that's barely maintained, survives on a fixed income that would be inadequate for proper horse care, and has no experience with large animals. Placing Thunder in her care would be irresponsible at best, potentially dangerous at worst." The attack on Dorothy's character and capabilities was delivered with surgical precision, each point designed to highlight the contrast between her modest circumstances and Blackwood's abundant resources. Sheriff Bradley found himself nodding along with the businessman's arguments, even as something about the presentation bothered him. "Furthermore," Blackwood added, warming to his theme, "I understand that Mrs. Henderson has become increasingly isolated in recent years. Neighbors have expressed concerns about her ability to maintain her property and manage her daily affairs. Is this really the kind of person who should be entrusted with the care of such an important animal?" Dr. Morse frowned at the characterization, her professional ethics troubled by the way Blackwood seemed to have researched Dorothy's personal circumstances. "Mr. Blackwood, while your facilities are impressive, I'm curious about your long-term plans for Thunder. Would he simply be pastured, or do you have specific activities in mind?" The question seemed to catch Blackwood slightly off guard, and his answer came with less fluidity than his previous responses. "Well, naturally, Thunder would be well cared for and comfortable. He might occasionally participate in demonstrations or special events at the club, nothing strenuous, of course. Our members appreciate authentic experiences, and Thunder's background as a police horse would certainly add historical interest to our programs." Sheriff Bradley's eyes narrowed as the true nature of Blackwood's interest became clearer. The businessman wasn't offering to care for Thunder out of pure altruism. He was proposing to turn the retired police horse into an attraction for his wealthy clientele. The thought of Thunder being displayed like a trophy for the entertainment of country club members left a sour taste in the sheriff's mouth. "Charles, are you suggesting that Thunder would be used for entertainment purposes?" Bradley asked, his voice carrying a new edge. Blackwood recognized the danger in the question and quickly adjusted his approach. "Not entertainment, Tom. Education, historical preservation. Thunder represents an important part of our community's law enforcement heritage. By sharing his story with visitors, we'd be honoring his service while ensuring he receives the best possible care." The justification sounded reasonable on the surface, but Sheriff Bradley could envision the reality. Thunder being led out for photo opportunities with wealthy tourists, his story sanitized and commercialized for the amusement of people who would never understand what he'd meant to the community he'd served. Margaret Foster finally found her voice, speaking up from behind her desk with uncharacteristic boldness. "Mr. Blackwood, with all due respect, Mrs. Henderson's offer came from genuine compassion. She's not looking to profit from Thunder's situation." Blackwood's smile became strained as he faced unexpected resistance from a county employee he'd assumed would defer to his authority. "Margaret, I'm sure Mrs. Henderson means well, but good intentions aren't enough when dealing with a valuable animal that requires professional care." The word "valuable" hung in the air, revealing more about Blackwood's perspective than he'd intended. Sheriff Bradley realized that the businessman saw Thunder not as a retired partner, deserving of peaceful rest, but as an asset with potential commercial value. Dr. Morse closed the folder containing Blackwood's proposal and looked directly at the businessman. "Mr. Blackwood, your facilities are certainly impressive, but I have concerns about using Thunder for any kind of public programs. His injury has left him with limitations that would make such activities potentially harmful to his long-term health." Blackwood, waved away the veterinarian's concerns with practiced dismissiveness. "Doctor, I'm confident that my staff can manage Thunder's limitations while still allowing him to contribute meaningfully to our educational programs. We're talking about light duty, nothing that would exacerbate his condition." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Blackwood systematically dismantling every argument in favor of Dorothy's proposal while promoting his own credentials and resources. His presentation was polished, professional, and utterly convincing to anyone who valued practical considerations over emotional attachments. As the meeting concluded, Sheriff Bradley found himself facing an impossible choice between the modest, heartfelt offer of an elderly woman who genuinely cared about Thunder's welfare and the comprehensive, well-funded proposal of a businessman whose motives seemed increasingly questionable. Blackwood's parting words echoed in the sheriff's mind as the silver Mercedes disappeared down Main Street, leaving behind the lingering scent of expensive cologne and the weight of difficult decisions still to be made. Rebecca Miller had been Dorothy Henderson's neighbor for 43 years, long enough to remember when the Victorian house on Maple Street had been the envy of the neighborhood, with its pristine white paint and gardens that drew admiring comments from everyone who passed by. At 75, Rebecca possessed the kind of sharp memory that made her the unofficial historian of their quiet residential street, and she'd watched with growing frustration as the community gradually forgot who Dorothy had once been. The breaking point came 3 days after Charles Blackwood's visit to the sheriff's office, when Rebecca overheard her own grandson repeating some of the cruel gossip that had begun circulating about Dorothy's ridiculous offer to care for Thunder. Young Bobby Miller, Deputy Jake's nephew, had absorbed the adult conversations around him and was now spreading the story that crazy old Mrs. Henderson thought she could handle a police horse when she could barely manage to keep her own yard tidy. Rebecca had held her tongue for too long, watching as her dear friend was dismissed and marginalized by people who had never bothered to learn anything about her history. That evening, she walked across the street to Dorothy's house, carrying a weathered photo album that she'd retrieved from her own attic and a determination to set the record straight. Dorothy opened the front door with obvious surprise, not accustomed to receiving visitors, especially after dark. Her grey hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and she wore a faded house dress that spoke of evenings spent alone with only the television for company. "Rebecca," Dorothy said, her voice carrying a mixture of pleasure and concern, "is everything all right?" "Dorothy Henderson, we need to talk," Rebecca replied, her tone carrying the authority of someone who had made an important decision. "And it's past time I reminded this town of exactly who you are." The two women settled in Dorothy's small living room, surrounded by furniture that had been elegant decades earlier, but now showed the wear of time and limited resources. Rebecca opened the photo album with reverence, revealing black and white photographs that transported them both back to a different era. The first photograph showed a young woman in riding attire, standing beside a magnificent thoroughbred with a confidence that radiated even through the faded image. Dorothy's hair was dark then, pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her posture spoke of someone completely at ease with powerful animals. The next photo showed her in a winner's circle, holding a trophy while the same horse stood patiently beside her, both of them covered in the dust and glory of victory. "Dorothy, do you remember when these were taken?" Rebecca asked softly, watching as her friend's eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. "Lexington, 1967, Dorothy replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "That was Thunder's dawn, after she won the Kentucky Futurity. I was 25 years old and thought I could conquer the world." Rebecca turned the pages slowly, revealing photograph after photograph of Dorothy working with horses of every size and temperament. There she was training a spirited stallion for the police department in Louisville, teaching riding techniques to wealthy clients at an exclusive stable outside Frankfurt, and working with problem horses that other trainers had given up on. "You were more than just a trainer," Rebecca reminded her friend. "You were known throughout Kentucky as someone who could reach the horses that no one else could handle. The difficult ones, the traumatized ones, the ones that everyone else considered hopeless." Dorothy studied the photographs with eyes that seemed to see beyond the faded images to memories that had been buried under decades of different priorities. She'd married young, started a family, and gradually stepped away from her career to focus on raising children and supporting her husband's business ventures. By the time she might have returned to training, the industry had changed, and her absence had been filled by younger trainers with modern techniques and better connections. "That was a long time ago, Rebecca," Dorothy said, though her fingers lingered on a photograph showing her working with a particularly challenging horse. "I'm not that person anymore." Rebecca closed the album and looked directly at her friend. "Dorothy Henderson, you are exactly that person. You've never stopped being that person. The only thing that's changed is that everyone else forgot what you were capable of." The next morning, Rebecca Miller appeared at the sheriff's office, carrying the same photo album and a manila folder filled with newspaper clippings, award certificates, and professional references that dated back nearly 5 decades. "Sheriff," Bradley looked up in surprise as the elderly woman entered with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. "Sheriff, I understand you've been having discussions about Thunder's future," Rebecca announced, settling the materials on his desk. With ceremony, "I think it's time you learned something about Dorothy Henderson that might change your perspective." Margaret Foster abandoned her typing to listen as Rebecca systematically presented evidence of Dorothy's forgotten expertise. The newspaper clippings told the story of a young woman who had earned respect in a male-dominated industry through skill, dedication, and an almost mystical ability to communicate with difficult horses. One article from the Lexington Herald described her as the horse whisperer of bluegrass country, while another detailed her innovative training techniques that had revolutionized how law enforcement agencies prepared their mounted units. Dr. Morse arrived during Rebecca's presentation, initially skeptical but increasingly intrigued as the evidence mounted. The veterinarian examined certificates from prestigious equine associations, references from police departments throughout Kentucky, and photographs that documented Dorothy's work with animals that bore striking similarities to Thunder in both size and temperament. "Mrs. Miller," Dr. Morse said carefully, "these credentials are impressive, but they're also quite old. Horse training techniques have evolved significantly since the 1960s and 70s. Rebecca smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had anticipated that exact objection. Dr. Dorothy Henderson didn't just follow techniques, she developed them. Half the modern training methods being used today were innovations she pioneered when you were probably still in elementary school." Deputy Miller, who had been listening with growing amazement, finally spoke up. "Why didn't Mrs. Henderson mention any of this when she came to talk about Thunder?" "Right." "Because," Rebecca replied with obvious frustration, "Dorothy has spent the last 20 years being told by everyone around her that she's too old, too frail, and too set in her ways to contribute anything meaningful. When people consistently treat you as if you're invisible, you start to believe it yourself." Sheriff Bradley studied the photographs with new understanding, seeing not just evidence of Dorothy's past accomplishments, but recognizing the confident posture and steady gaze of someone who had once commanded respect in a demanding profession. The woman in these pictures bore little resemblance to the hesitant elderly lady who had sat in his office pleading for the chance to care for Thunder. "Mrs. Miller," the sheriff said slowly, "this information certainly puts Mrs. Henderson's offer in a different light. But she's been out of the profession for many years. Do you really think she still has the physical capability to work with a horse like Thunder?" Rebecca's answer was interrupted by the arrival of Charles Blackwood, who entered the office with his usual confidence, but paused when he saw the photographs spread across the sheriff's desk. His sharp business instincts immediately recognized a potential threat to his carefully crafted proposal. "Good morning, everyone," Blackwood said, his tone carefully neutral as he assessed the situation. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Margaret Foster took obvious pleasure in explaining the morning's revelations to the businessman, watching his expression grow increasingly troubled as the scope of Dorothy's credentials became clear. Blackwood examined the photographs with the calculating gaze of someone reassessing a competitor he'd underestimated. "These are certainly interesting historical documents," Blackwood said dismissively, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "But, Sheriff, we must be realistic about the present situation. Mrs. Henderson may have had skills 50 years ago, but that doesn't qualify her to care for Thunder today." Dr. Morse found herself in the unexpected position of defending someone she doubted just days earlier. "Mr. Blackwood, experience with horses isn't something you simply lose with age. It becomes instinctive, part of who you are." Blackwood recognized the shift in the room's dynamics and adjusted his strategy accordingly. "Doctor, I have tremendous respect for Mrs. Henderson's past accomplishments, but caring for Thunder requires more than historical expertise. It requires current physical capability, financial resources, and proper facilities. All of which she apparently managed quite successfully for decades," Rebecca interjected, her tone carrying an edge that suggested she was prepared for a fight. The businessman realized that his careful campaign to discredit Dorothy had suffered a significant setback. He'd spent days highlighting her limitations and portraying her as a foolish old woman acting on misguided impulses. The revelation of her professional background threatened to transform her from a liability into a credible alternative to his own proposal. "Perhaps," Blackwood said thoughtfully, "we should put this matter to a practical test. If Mrs. Henderson believes she can handle Thunder, let her demonstrate her capabilities. I'm sure we could arrange for a supervised interaction between them, under proper safety protocols, of course." The suggestion caught everyone off guard, particularly Rebecca, who recognized the challenge in Blackwood's tone. Sheriff Bradley considered the proposal, seeing both its merits and its potential dangers. "Mr. Blackwood," the sheriff said carefully, "are you suggesting some kind of formal evaluation?" "Oh, exactly," Blackwood replied, his confidence returning as he seized control of the situation. "Let Mrs. Henderson show us what she can do with Thunder. If she demonstrates genuine capability, then perhaps her proposal deserves serious consideration. If not, then we can proceed with the understanding that good intentions aren't enough when dealing with such a valuable and potentially dangerous animal." Dr. Morse shifted uncomfortably at the suggestion, her professional instincts warning her about the risks involved in such a demonstration. Thunder was injured, unpredictable, and had shown increasing agitation as his situation remained unresolved. Asking an elderly woman, regardless of her past experience, to work with him under pressure seemed both unfair and potentially dangerous. Rebecca Miller, however, recognized the challenge for what it was: Charles Blackwood's attempt to publicly humiliate Dorothy and eliminate her as a threat to his plans. The businessman was confident that an elderly woman who hadn't worked with horses in decades would fail spectacularly. thereby validating his own proposal and discrediting Dorothy's supporters. "Sheriff," Rebecca said firmly, "I think Mr. Blackwood's suggestion has merit. Dorothy deserves the chance to prove herself, and Thunder deserves to be cared for by someone who understands him." As the morning wore on, the details of the proposed demonstration were discussed and refined, with safety protocols established and parameters defined. What had begun as a simple discussion of Dorothy's credentials had evolved into a public test that would determine not only Thunder's future, but also whether a forgotten expert could reclaim her place in a world that had moved on without her. The town square of Millbrook had never seen a crowd quite like the one that gathered on that crisp Saturday morning in late October. Word of the unprecedented demonstration had spread through social media, local radio, and the kind of determined gossip that could transform a small Kentucky town into the center of unexpected attention. Nearly 300 people filled the space around the old Civil War monument, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and genuine concern for both Thunder and Dorothy Henderson. Sheriff Bradley stood near the makeshift arena that had been created using portable fencing borrowed from the county fairgrounds. His stomach churned with anxiety as he watched the crowd continue to grow, knowing that whatever happened in the next hour would be witnessed by half the county and probably shared across the internet before evening. The simple question of Thunder's care had evolved into something much larger, a public referendum on the value of experience versus resources, compassion versus pragmatism. Dorothy arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, her small figure almost lost in the sea of faces as she walked slowly across the square. She wore practical clothes today, dark jeans that looked newly purchased, sturdy boots that spoke of serious intent, and a plain white blouse that gave her an air of quiet professionalism. Her grey hair was pulled back in the same practical ponytail she'd worn in the photographs Rebecca had shared, and her hands were steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. Dr. Morse had arrived early to oversee Thunder's preparation, her professional anxiety evident as she checked and rechecked the safety protocols they'd established. The stallion stood quietly in a temporary stall, his dark coat gleaming in the morning sun, but his eyes held the wariness of an animal that had endured too many disruptions to his routine. His injured leg was clearly favoring him, a visible reminder of the limitations that had led to this moment. Charles Blackwood positioned himself prominently near the judges' table that had been set up for the county commissioners who would observe the demonstration. His expensive, casual wear and confident posture marked him as someone accustomed to being the center of attention at community events. He'd spent the week quietly reinforcing his position with key officials, emphasizing the risks involved in Dorothy's proposal and the superiority of his own facilities. The local media had arrived in force, with Sarah Chen from the Millbrook Gazette joined by reporters from regional newspapers and even a television crew from Louisville that had caught wind of the unusual story. Their cameras and equipment added a circus atmosphere that made some observers uncomfortable, but Dorothy seemed oblivious to everything except the task ahead of her. Rebecca Miller had claimed a spot in the front row, her weathered hands clutched around the photo album she'd brought as evidence of Dorothy's credentials. She watched her friend with a mixture of pride and terror, knowing that the next hour would either vindicate decades of quiet expertise or expose Dorothy to public humiliation that could destroy what little confidence she had remaining. Deputy Jake Miller stood beside the arena entrance, his role as Thunder's final handler weighing heavily on his young shoulders. He'd been the one riding Thunder during the accident that had started this entire controversy, and his guilt had only intensified. As the situation became increasingly public, the young officer found himself genuinely hoping that Dorothy would succeed, if only to provide some redemption for the animal he felt responsible for injuring. At exactly 10:15, Sheriff Bradley called for attention and outlined the parameters of the demonstration. Dorothy would enter the arena alone with Thunder, supervised by Dr. Morse and several safety personnel positioned around the perimeter. She would have 30 minutes to demonstrate her ability to work safely and effectively with the injured stallion, using whatever techniques she felt appropriate. "Ladies and gentlemen," the sheriff announced, his voice carrying across the square through the portable sound system, "today we're here to evaluate Mrs. Dorothy Henderson's proposal to provide care for Thunder. This is not entertainment, but a serious assessment of capabilities that will help determine this animal's future." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Thunder was led into the arena, his impressive size and obvious injury drawing gasps from some of the younger spectators. The stallion's head was high, his nostrils flared with the stress of being surrounded by so many unfamiliar people. He moved carefully, clearly favoring his injured leg, but still maintained the proud bearing that had made him legendary throughout the county. Dorothy entered the arena moments later, and the contrast between her small stature and Thunder's imposing presence was immediately apparent to everyone watching. She carried no equipment except a simple rope halter, her movements deliberate and unhurried as she approached the nervous animal. The crowd fell silent, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. Blackwood leaned toward Commissioner Williams and spoke in a voice just loud enough for nearby observers to hear. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. That woman is going to get herself hurt, and we'll all be liable for allowing this dangerous demonstration." But Dorothy seemed unaware of the businessman's commentary or the hundreds of eyes focused on her every movement. She stopped several feet away from Thunder and simply stood still, her posture relaxed but attentive as she allowed the stallion to assess her presence. For long minutes, nothing seemed to happen, and some spectators began to shift restlessly. Thunder's ears moved constantly, swiveling toward Dorothy and then away as he tried to process the unusual situation. His injury made him more defensive than usual, and the stress of recent weeks had left him suspicious of human intentions. Several handlers had attempted to work with him since the accident, but he'd remained resistant to everyone except the small group of officers he'd known for years. Dorothy began to hum, a soft melody that carried just far enough for Thunder to hear, but didn't disturb the crowd's hushed attention. The sound seemed to reach something deep in the animal's memory, perhaps echoing the countless hours she'd spent with difficult horses decades earlier. Thunder's head lowered slightly, and his stance became less rigid. Dr. Morse watched with growing fascination as Dorothy gradually closed the distance between herself and the stallion. The elderly woman's movements were economical and purposeful, each step calculated to communicate safety rather than threat. When she finally reached Thunder's side, she placed one weathered hand on his neck with a gentleness that spoke of genuine understanding. The crowd held its collective breath as Dorothy began working with Thunder, her hands moving over his body with the confidence of someone assessing an old friend. She examined his injured leg with professional competence, her touch apparently causing no distress to the animal who had resisted similar examinations from strangers. Thunder stood quietly, his eyes softening as he responded to Dorothy's calm presence. "Look at that," Rebecca whispered to the woman beside her. "She hasn't lost it, not one bit." Dorothy's work with Thunder gradually became more complex as she guided him through simple movements that demonstrated both her control and his willingness to respond. The stallion followed her subtle signals with an attentiveness that amazed the professional observers, including Dr. Morse, who had not expected to see such immediate cooperation. Blackwood's expression grew increasingly troubled as the demonstration progressed. He'd been confident that Dorothy would fail spectacularly, proving his point about her inadequacy and clearing the way for his own proposal. Instead, he was watching a masterful display of horsemanship that threatened to undermine everything he'd argued about her limitations. "She's just lucky the horse is tired," Blackwood commented loudly, but his words lacked conviction and drew sharp looks from nearby spectators who could see perfectly well what was happening in the arena. The real test came when Dorothy attempted to work with Thunder's injured leg, an examination that had proven difficult for everyone else who had tried. The stallion had become defensive about his injury, striking out at handlers who tried to assess the damage. But when Dorothy approached the sensitive area, Thunder stood perfectly still, allowing her to manipulate the leg gently while she murmured reassuring words that only he could hear. Sarah Chen snapped photograph after photograph, recognizing that she was documenting something remarkable. The image of the elderly woman working confidently with the massive stallion would grace the front page of newspapers throughout the region. But in the moment, she was simply captivated by the display of mutual trust between human and animal. As the 30-minute demonstration neared its conclusion, Dorothy guided Thunder through a series of exercises that showcased both his remaining capabilities and her ability to work within his limitations. The stallion responded to her commands with an eagerness that had been absent for weeks, as if he had finally found someone who understood both his potential and his pain. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause as Dorothy completed the demonstration, but she seemed focused only on Thunder, rewarding him with gentle strokes and quiet words of praise. The connection between them was so obvious that even the most skeptical observers had to acknowledge what they'd witnessed. Commissioner Williams, who had arrived prepared to support Blackwood's proposal, found himself reconsidering his position as he watched Dorothy's final interactions with Thunder. "Sheriff Bradley," he called out, "I think we need to have a serious discussion about Mrs. Henderson's qualifications." Blackwood realized that his careful campaign to discredit Dorothy had suffered a devastating blow. The demonstration had revealed not just her technical competence, but also the genuine bond she'd formed with Thunder in just 30 minutes. His political instincts told him that public opinion had shifted decisively against his position. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, stepping toward the arena with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to controlling difficult situations. "While Mrs. Henderson has certainly shown some skill with Thunder, we must remember that caring for a horse involves much more than a single demonstration. The daily responsibilities, the financial commitment, the long-term physical demands, these are the real tests of capability." But his words fell on increasingly deaf ears as the crowd began to disperse, many stopping to congratulate Dorothy on her remarkable performance. Children pressed against the fence to get a closer look at Thunder, who seemed more relaxed than he'd been in weeks, and parents found themselves explaining to their youngsters that sometimes the most unlikely heroes were hiding in plain sight. Rebecca Miller made her way through the crowd to reach her friend, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she witnessed Dorothy's transformation back into the confident horsewoman she'd once been. The demonstration had proven more than just technical competence. It had revealed that some connections transcend age, circumstance, and the judgment of those who measure worth only in material terms. As the crowd gradually dispersed and the equipment was packed away, Thunder remained calm and attentive at Dorothy's side, as if he understood that his future now rested in the hands of someone who truly saw him not as a liability or an attraction, but as a partner deserving of respect and care. The decision came 3 days after the demonstration, delivered in a formal letter from the county commissioners that arrived at Dorothy Henderson's mailbox on a Tuesday morning that smelled of approaching winter. She read the words twice before their meaning fully registered. Thunder was hers, officially and permanently, with all liability transferred and all legal documents properly executed. The letter was signed by all 5 commissioners, including the 2 who had originally supported Charles Blackwood's proposal. Dorothy sat on her front porch steps, the official papers trembling in her hands as tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally began to flow. At 78 years old, she'd stopped believing that life held any more surprises, any more chances to matter in ways that felt meaningful. The community that had written her off as a burden now recognized her as Thunder's salvation, and the validation felt both overwhelming and strangely familiar, like returning to a version of herself she'd thought was gone forever. Rebecca Miller found her there an hour later, still clutching the letter and staring across the street as if seeing her neighborhood with new eyes. The two women embraced without speaking, their friendship deepened by the shared understanding that sometimes redemption comes not through grand gestures, but through quiet persistence in the face of dismissal and doubt. "Dorothy," Rebecca said softly, "you did it. You actually did it." "We did it," Dorothy corrected, recognizing that without Rebecca's intervention, her expertise would have remained buried under years of community indifference. "Thunder and I, we both got a second chance because you refused to let everyone forget who I used to be." The logistics of bringing Thunder home required careful planning that drew support from unexpected corners of the community. Jake Miller, the young deputy whose guilt over Thunder's accident had evolved into genuine advocacy for Dorothy's cause, volunteered to coordinate the modifications needed to make her property suitable for a horse of Thunder's size and needs. Local contractors, moved by the story and perhaps embarrassed by their previous dismissal of Dorothy's capabilities, donated labor and materials for building a proper shelter and installing appropriate fencing. Dr. Morse supervised Thunder's transition with the attention to detail that had made her reputation throughout the region. The stallion's injury would require ongoing management, but with proper care and realistic expectations about his capabilities, there was no reason he couldn't enjoy years of comfortable retirement. More importantly, his response to Dorothy during and after the demonstration had convinced the veterinarian that their partnership offered the best possible outcome for his emotional and physical well-being. Charles Blackwood's reaction to the commissioner's decision revealed a side of his personality that his carefully crafted public image usually concealed. His anger at losing what he'd considered a certain victory manifested in bitter comments to anyone who would listen. Complaints about sentimentality overruling sound, judgment and dark predictions about the inevitable failure of Dorothy's arrangement. "Mark my words," he told Commissioner Williams during a chance encounter at the bank, "that woman is going to be overwhelmed within 6 months. When she comes, begging for help, don't expect me to clean up the mess you've created." But Williams, who had witnessed Dorothy's demonstration along with hundreds of other community members, was no longer receptive to Blackwood's arguments. "Charles, I think you underestimated Mrs. Henderson. We all did. Sometimes the best solution isn't the most expensive one." The businessman's campaign to undermine Dorothy's credibility had backfired spectacularly, revealing not just his commercial motivations, but also his willingness to attack an elderly woman to achieve his goals. The community that had once deferred to his opinions now viewed him with suspicion, and several members of his exclusive country club quietly began questioning the character of a man who would try to humiliate someone as vulnerable as Dorothy. Henderson. Thunder's arrival at Dorothy's property on Maple Street drew a crowd that reminded everyone of his demonstration in the town square. The stallion walked calmly from the trailer, his eyes immediately seeking out Dorothy among the group of well-wishers who had gathered to witness his homecoming. When he spotted her standing by the gate to his new paddock, his soft whinny of recognition brought tears to more than a few observers. The simple act of Dorothy leading Thunder into his new home carried symbolic weight that extended far beyond the practical arrangement of animal care. Here was a woman who had been invisible to her neighbors, reclaiming her place as someone with valuable skills to offer. Here was a horse who had faced an uncertain future, finding security with someone who understood his worth beyond his ability to perform specific duties. Margaret Foster, from the sheriff's office, attended the homecoming ceremony, bringing with her a framed photograph of Thunder during his years of active service. "Dorothy," she said as she presented the gift, "we wanted you to have this so Thunder's history isn't forgotten." Dorothy accepted the photograph with the reverence it deserved, understanding that she was now the guardian not just of Thunder's present and future, but also of the legacy he'd built serving the community. The responsibility felt both heavy and honor, a trust that connected her to something larger than her own small world. The first weeks of their partnership established routines that benefited both Dorothy and Thunder. The stallion's presence gave structure to Dorothy's days, requiring her to wake early for feeding and care, to monitor his condition and adjust his treatment as needed, and to engage with the steady stream of visitors who came to check on his progress. Dr. Morse made regular visits, initially motivated by professional concern, but increasingly drawn by her fascination with the remarkable partnership she was witnessing. "Dorothy, I have to admit something," the veterinarian said during one of her weekly examinations. "When you first proposed caring for Thunder, I thought you were being foolishly optimistic about both your capabilities and his prognosis. I was wrong on both counts." Thunder's physical condition had improved markedly under Dorothy's care, but more significantly, his emotional state had transformed completely. The weariness and depression that had characterized his final weeks of active duty had been replaced by alertness and contentment that spoke to his recognition that he was valued for who he was rather than what he could do. Dorothy herself had undergone an equally remarkable transformation. The hesitant, apologetic woman who had first appeared in Sheriff Bradley's office had been replaced by someone who moved with quiet confidence and spoke with the authority of expertise reclaimed. Neighbors who had barely acknowledged her existence now sought her advice on everything from gardening to pet care, recognizing that they had overlooked a wealth of knowledge and experience. The story of Dorothy and Thunder attracted attention far beyond Millbrook, generating newspaper articles, social media posts, and even a segment on a regional television program that focused on heartwarming community stories. The coverage brought visitors from across Kentucky and beyond, people who wanted to meet the elderly woman who had refused to accept that age diminished worth, and the horse who had found new purpose in peaceful retirement. Rebecca Miller, who had played such a crucial role in revealing Dorothy's hidden past, found herself serving as an unofficial spokesperson for what local media had dubbed the Thunder Miracle. Her willingness to share Dorothy's story had not only saved Thunder, but had also reminded the community that their elderly residents possessed histories and capabilities that deserved recognition rather than dismissal. "The real miracle," Rebecca told a reporter from Louisville, "isn't that Dorothy could still work with horses after all these years. The miracle is that we almost let prejudice about age blind us to someone's true value." Charles Blackwood eventually ceased his public criticism of Dorothy's arrangement, partly because his complaints were falling on deaf ears, and partly because the obvious success of Thunder's transition made his predictions of disaster increasingly hollow. His reputation in the community never fully recovered from his treatment of Dorothy, and several business relationships cooled as people reassessed their opinion of his character. Sheriff Bradley made regular visits to check on Thunder, partly from professional obligation, but mostly from genuine pleasure in seeing the remarkable partnership that had developed. The horse that had been his department's most reliable partner had found a retirement that honored his years of service while providing the specialized care his injury required. "Dorothy," the sheriff said during one of his visits, "I owe you an apology. When you first came to my office, I saw only the problems with your proposal. I should have seen the possibilities." Dorothy accepted his apology with characteristic grace, understanding that his initial skepticism had been based on reasonable concerns rather than malicious intent. The experience had taught her that judgment often comes from incomplete information, and that persistence can sometimes overcome even well-intentioned resistance. As winter settled over Millbrook, Thunder and Dorothy established rhythms that satisfied both their practical needs and their emotional connection. The stallion's days were filled with gentle exercise, careful grooming, and the kind of attentive care that honored his dignity while accommodating his limitations. Dorothy's days were filled with purpose and recognition, the validation that comes from being needed and valued for skills that she had thought were forgotten. The last significant visitor of their first year together was Dr. Patricia Morse, who came not for a medical examination, but to document Thunder's remarkable recovery and Dorothy's successful transition from isolation to community engagement. The veterinarian had been contacted by the Kentucky Veterinary Association about presenting their story at the state conference as an example of creative solutions to animal welfare challenges. "Dorothy, would you be willing to share your experience with other veterinarians and animal care professionals?" Dr. Morse asked. "Your approach to Thunder's rehabilitation has exceeded every expectation, and there might be other situations where your insights could help." The invitation represented yet another validation of Dorothy's expertise, recognition from the professional community that her techniques and understanding remained valuable despite the decades she'd spent away from formal horse training. More importantly, it offered the possibility that her partnership with Thunder might inspire similar solutions for other animals and caregivers facing seemingly impossible circumstances. As Dorothy considered the invitation, Thunder stood quietly in his paddock, his dark coat gleaming with health and his eyes reflecting the contentment that comes from being genuinely valued. The horse, who had once faced an uncertain end, had become a symbol of second chances, and the woman who had once been invisible to her community had reclaimed her place as someone whose knowledge and compassion could make a difference. Their story had become more than just a tale of rescue and redemption. It had evolved into a reminder that society too often overlooks the potential contributions of those it deems past their usefulness, that assumptions about age and capability can blind communities to valuable resources, and that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can produce the most remarkable results. The evening sun cast long shadows across Dorothy's yard as she stood beside Thunder's fence, her weathered hands gentle on his neck, while she whispered the same soft reassurances that had calmed him during their first meeting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight they were simply an elderly woman and a retired police horse who had found in each other the chance to matter again, to contribute, and to prove that worth isn't determined by youth or perfect health, but by the willingness to care and the wisdom that comes from experience. In the distance, Rebecca Miller watched from her kitchen window, smiling at the sight of her friend, who had been transformed not by magic, but by the simple act of being recognized for who she truly was. The story of Dorothy Henderson and Thunder would continue to unfold, one day at a time, one small victory at a time, a testament to the power of persistence and the value of seeing beyond surface. Appearances to recognize the extraordinary potential that often hides in plain sight. Dear friends and viewers, we hope Dorothy and Thunder's incredible journey has touched your hearts as much as it has touched ours. Their story reminds us that second chances can come at any age, and that true value lies not in what we can no longer do, but in the wisdom and love we can still offer. If this heartwarming tale of resilience and redemption moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that celebrate the extraordinary power of the human spirit. Hit that like button to show your support and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear about second chances in your own life or in your community. Every day, we bring you stories that prove miracles can happen when compassion meets determination, so don't miss our upcoming videos. Thank you for joining Dorothy and Thunder on their journey, and remember that it's never too late to discover that you still matter, you still have value, and you still have so much to give to the world.